you did not get a handout, there should be some in the back still. All right, good to see everyone here this morning. If you want to open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 12, we'll pick up there where we left off last week. But before that, we'll start with a word of prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for this beautiful day, and we thank you for this time we have this morning to continue our study of the book of Genesis, and as we especially consider how it points us to your Son, and we're mindful that much of the world is remembering your Son and his resurrection today, and we are grateful that we have a risen Savior. We pray that you'll be with us this hour and guide us in our study, open our minds to your word and the application you want us to see. And it's in his name we pray. Amen. All right. So, as we consider this first section of Abraham's life, we really don't know much about his early life because, as we mentioned last week, when we pick up with Abraham, he's already 75 years old. We don't know much about his early life, but as we consider this first section of his life that is recorded for us, we're going to begin to learn why we would say Abraham is this great man of faith. And Abraham is one of many people in the Bible that we might call an archetype of Christ. His life and the events of it and his attributes are going to foreshadow things to come with Christ, that we see with Christ. And so some other examples we might call archetypes of Christ are Noah, that we've already covered, Moses, David, and there's others as well. But unlike Christ, who Abraham points us to, we're going to see that Abraham, like those other men, is not perfect. And so we're going to see that he's not this superhero, larger-than-life character. I think sometimes we get that in our heads when we think about men like Abraham and Moses and David. But he's a real person who is just like us, that I think we can relate to. And we're going to see that, as we saw with Noah, who was a very faithful, righteous man, that Abraham too is going to make some mistakes and has some flaws, and he's going to face some real challenges and real temptations as well. So we're picking up around verse 4 in chapter 12. Remember, last week we talked about the beginning of chapter 12, and we talked about these promises that God gives Abraham when he speaks to him. And God actually tells Abraham several things there in the first few verses that he's going to do and how he's going to bless him. But most significantly, there's three promises I want you to remember and keep in mind. Anybody remember what those are? What was the first one? The land promise. What was the other one? The nation promise. I'll make you into a great nation. And then what's the last one? Was that the seed promise? Yes, very good. But of course, there's a problem with all three of those promises, because what does Abraham not have at this point? Doesn't have a child. Sarah's unable to conceive, we've already been told. And so Abraham's descendants can inherit the promised land if there aren't any. Abraham's descendants can't become a great nation if he doesn't have any. And the nations of the world cannot be blessed through one of Abraham's descendants if he has zero, right? So that problem is going to be kind of the backdrop for our next several chapters and how that is going to be solved. But these promises are very important because they serve as the start of a covenant relationship between God and Abraham. What is a covenant? What's another word for a covenant? An agreement. Yeah, an agreement, or it's kind of like a contract. It's not really just a promise because it involves mutual promises. That's what an agreement in real life, not that this is not real life, but in day-to-day life that you deal with, that's what an agreement is. So-and-so promises to do something, and the other person, part of the agreement, agrees to do something in return. And so what we're seeing is this formation of a covenant or an agreement between God and Abraham. God is promising to do these things here that he says in chapter 12, and in return, at least to start with, Abraham is to go in faith with God, to go to where God is going to show him. So that is the instruction God gives here in chapter 12. Go from your country to a land that I will show you. What is challenging about that instruction here? Why is that easier said than done? Yes, ma'am. Sure. Yeah, it's going to be hard living, I think. He's not able to just take everything with him. He's going to take some things, but he's told to go from your relatives and from your father's house. And yeah, we don't like change. What else? He doesn't know where he's going. I think it's a little easier to be given if you're given a destination, right? If my wife tells me to go on an errand and she just tells me to go run some errands, that's hard to wrap my head around. But if she says go buy milk, I know exactly what to do, and I'm going to be a little more receptive to that instruction, I think. So that's another challenge. What else? The people that are going to be there when he gets there. Yeah, he doesn't even know necessarily who he's going to interact with, but there's certainly going to be people around him, and that's going to be a cause for some challenges. We already mentioned his age. Do you think it's a little different to pack up and leave and totally change your life at 75 than it is at 25? Yeah. Now, yeah, I mean, I think things are still changing a little bit. So 75 is maybe not quite what 75 is today. But still, he's not at the beginning of his life. He's kind of well settled where he is. Um, Keep in mind that this is a different day and age. This is a different culture. It's pretty normal for people to pack up and leave and move away from their family nowadays. If they get a job or whatever, that's pretty common. It's even common for people in older age to pack up and move away to a far place like, say, Florida. People do that, right? But this is a different time and place. It would have been a very, I think, startling thing for Abraham to have to do to leave his family behind. And presumably, this is the first time that God has called on Abraham. We don't know that for certain, but it seems to be. And so God is promising to do these things for Abraham, but he hasn't seen those things fulfilled. He's having to act in faith in doing that. All right. But what do we see Abraham doing in verse 4? So Abraham went away as the Lord had spoken to him. And so right away, what do we see as what makes Abraham a man of faith? Action. Yeah, it's obedience. God tells him to go, and he went. All right, so right away we see that what makes Abraham a man of faith is his obedience. And I don't think it's that Abraham just had the strongest amount of belief and he had the least amount of doubt. That may have been true, but what makes Abraham a man of faith is that he did what God told him to do. And I think that's important to keep in mind when we think about faith. Faith is more than just belief. I think sometimes we kind of equate those two things, that faith is belief, but really I think faith is belief in action. Look over at Hebrews 11. You may want to keep your finger there because we're going to come back to it a few times this morning. If you look at Hebrews 11 in verse 8, it says, "By faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he left not knowing where he was going." So that's making the point that, again, he doesn't know where he's going. That's going to be challenging. But by faith, when he was called, he obeyed and did what God said. And if we think about this, hopefully you've had a chance to read that. I've suggested that. If you haven't read through Hebrews chapter 11, it's going to be helpful in our study. But if I think about one of the things that kind of unites this list of names in Hebrews chapter 11, along with Abraham, it's that they believed in the promises of God. And they acted in faith, even though they were not going to see the promises fulfilled. I mean, think about that. Abraham is not going to see these promises fulfilled, and yet he obeyed. Jump down to verse 13 in Hebrews 11. It says, all these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen and welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been thinking of that country which they left, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. I think too often our faith is kind of determined by the here and now. What we think God is doing for us now, what we think God has done for us. And so if God has done the things we would expect him to do or want him to do, then we'll act, we'll obey, we'll have some faith. But maybe if he's not acted in the way we would hope or done the things in our life that we would hope, then our faith may start to falter. But Abraham is not living in the here and now when we think about his life. He's not thinking about the things he's leaving behind in Ur. He's not concerned about where he's going to go, where he's going to lay his head, where he's going to pitch his tent. He is focused on these promises. He is living with those promises in mind. And he is not worried about his old country. He is looking forward to a new country, not in this life, but a heavenly country, as the Hebrew writer says. And so because of that, I love what is said there at the end. Because of that, God is not ashamed to be called the God of Abraham. And same for these other names mentioned here in Hebrews 11. Yeah, and we'll certainly get to that story. That was certainly what really proved Abraham's faith. But think about that. Imagine, would that we could all live in such a way that God would say, I'm not ashamed to be called the God of Jered or the God of whoever. Think about that. That would be a great thing to be said about each of us, and that's said about Abraham here. So coming back to Genesis 12, one detail that is mentioned in terms of who and what he brings with him in verse 5 is that he brings who with him? He brings Lot. All right, so some will point out that this kind of shows some half-hearted obedience on Abraham's part. He's told to leave his father's house, leave his relatives, and yet he brings Lot. I don't necessarily agree with that assessment. Lot may very well have been considered his heir at this point. I think there's a lot of reason to believe that because Abraham doesn't have children. Lot's father has died at this point. 2 Peter 2 and verse 8 actually tells us that Lot was a righteous man. So if the point of Abraham leaving behind his family because they were pagan, very likely, that's not necessarily frustrated by him bringing Lot along with him. But either way, we're going to see that Lot coming along with Abraham is going to cause some issues down the road for Abraham in the next several chapters. So as we keep reading, Abraham begins his journey and he comes to the promised land. We don't know exactly how much time passes, but fairly quickly. In verses 7 through 9, we read about him coming to the land of Canaan and seeing it. And there's something very interesting that's mentioned in verse 7. It says, and the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. If you're paying really close attention, you'll notice that this is the first time we read in the book of Genesis that God appeared to someone. Now, several times we've read that God spoke to someone. He speaks to Adam and Eve. He speaks to Cain. He speaks to Noah several times. But this is the first time it's actually said that God appeared to someone. Doesn't necessarily mean that God never appeared to anyone prior to this, but this is the first time it is mentioned for us. And so you can make of that what you will. to me, it indicates, I think, the special relationship that God has with God and Abraham. But here again, that land promise is made very clear. This promised land, this land of Canaan, is going to be given to your descendants. And again, despite any doubt Abraham may have, I think if when we get to chapter 15, we're going to see that he does, I think, question some of this to some degree. Despite that, we still see him doing what? Acting in faith, worshiping God, building an altar to the Lord. So Abraham is going to keep moving, though. He's not going to stay put. He's going to move. He's eventually going to pitch his tent between Bethel and Ai. So you're going to start to see some names that may be familiar of places in the land of Canaan. Again, he builds an altar there, and he's going to continue journeying to the Negev, or what they would have referred to as the south there. I just want to point out to you, as we see Abraham journeying through here, notice that he's not really planting roots. He's not really settling. He's living in what? What is he living in? A tent. And I just want to point out to you kind of a distinction there between Abraham and what we see from some of the, what we would consider wicked people in the book of Genesis. If you think about Cain, God told Cain that he would wander as part of his punishment, and yet we see Cain setting out to build a city. If you think about the Tower of Babel that we talked about, I think, last week, what did they want to do? They wanted to not just build a tower, but they wanted to build a city and make a name for themselves. And if we think about, throughout the Bible and really throughout history, there seems to be whenever you have a big city that pops up, people getting together, there's often wickedness that follows from it. But Abraham is not setting down roots in his life or building a city of his own at this point. He is looking for a better city. Again, go back to Hebrews chapter 11 in verse 9. It says, by faith, talking about Abraham, by faith he lived as a stranger in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. If you think about what sets people of faith like Abraham apart, it's not setting roots in this world, but looking for a foundation that is going to last in eternity. And we certainly see that in Abraham's life. The only thing he's building as he goes along are altars and places of worship for God. All right. Let's move on into verse 10 and 20. I'm not going to, for sake of time, I won't read through all this. Again, it's important for you to read these sections beforehand so that you kind of know what's going on. But what happens is, in verse 10, we read that there was a severe famine in the land where Abram was. And so he goes down to what seems to be in the Bible the place you go whenever there's a famine, Egypt. So he goes to Egypt, and we're told that he's going to stay there for a time. And if you recall the story, Abram is concerned because what we read about Sarah is that she is very beautiful. And so he is concerned that some Egyptian is going to want to take her as a wife. And what do you think they're going to want to do to Abraham if that happens? They're going to kill him, all right? Because we can't have this husband laying around. They're going to kill him. And so that's his concern. And so he asks her to lie and say that he is her brother. And the implication, I think, just knowing the cultural customs of that day, is that if he's her brother and he's responsible for her, that anyone who wants to marry her and take her as wife is really going to have to get his permission. And so he can say no to that, of course, but that's going to, I guess, prevent her from being taken, but also kind of save his own skin. Some people point out that the decision to go to Egypt in the first place shows a lack of faith from Abraham. And, I won't take the time to go through all the rationale for that. I don't think we really have a ton of evidence to believe that. Is it possible that was showing some doubt on Abraham's part and God's willingness to provide for him? Maybe. But clearly what ends up transpiring is not good. It kind of spirals out of control. And what I want to focus on is what happens when he does go to Egypt. So if we think about what Abraham is trying to do in this lie that he concocts, there's on the face of it, we might say good reason for it, at least in Abraham's mind. It makes sense what he is trying to do. And if we think about the reasons we lie, unless you're just a pathological liar, I think there's normally some rationale behind our lying. Why do we normally tell lies? Yeah, to save our own skin, I would say, is one of the main reasons. Something bad in our minds will happen to us if we tell the truth or if the truth comes out. So that's one big reason. Yeah, to not hurt someone else. We often think, okay, I know it's not good to lie. I think generally good people, if I can use that term, don't set out to just lie in order to hurt and hurt people. They lie to save their own skin, or they think that what will happen if the truth comes out is going to be a worse outcome in general. Right? So I might lie to protect someone else or whatever. And so Abraham's lying here is really no different than I think what we would see in our own lives. He's got a rationale behind it. Yes, ma'am. She was what? Yeah, there's a little bit of relation there. Yeah. Yeah, but it's clearly at the very least a half truth to say that he's her sister and not his wife. Um, so I think we can kind of relate to Abraham in this story. He's lying to save his own skin. He's lying to avoid a bad situation, and so we might understand that. And that might also, how does that maybe show a lack of faith in his part? What has God told him he's going to do? What's that? Yeah, he's gonna have he can't die. He can't have a child and die at this point, right? So that's one pretty practical reason why you should know that this outcome he's afraid of is not going to happen. But he's also said, "I'll bless you. I'll even bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you." So Abraham should have in his mind known that God's going to take care of us in Egypt, and we really shouldn't be worried about this. And so this is Abraham and Sarah kind of taking matters into their own hands, and we'll see that again here in the next few chapters as well. So they get there. The problem, though, is as often is the case with lying, things don't go exactly as we plan. The lie kind of spirals out of control, and what happens is that it's not just some random Egyptian that casts their eye on Sarah and wants her as a wife. It's who? Pharaoh. And Pharaoh doesn't really have to worry about customs of asking the brother for permission. So it doesn't matter that he thinks Abram is her brother. He just, the way we read, he just takes Sarah as his wife. He does compensate Abram for the trouble. And so this is at least part of why Abram goes on to become a rich man. And so the situation that they're trying to avoid, happens anyway. And so that's a good example of how when we try to do things our own way, we often make things worse, and we certainly can't always provide our own solutions. So as we read on, God strikes Pharaoh and his house with plagues because of Sarah, and eventually Pharaoh runs Abraham and his family out of Egypt, and Abram's going to take those possessions that Pharaoh would give him. So notice some parallels here with the story of Exodus. So you've got what is it that starts this whole chain of events? Famine. All right. How did Jacob's family end up in Egypt? A famine. Yeah. They come after Joseph is already there. They come after a famine, and they end up staying for a long time. And what is it that leads to the Exodus? Pharaoh runs the Israelites out after a bunch of plagues, right? So you kind of see some parallels there in this story with the book of Exodus. So why do you think this story is here? I kind of asked you the same question with Noah. I mean, it's set up that Abraham is going to be this great man of faith that God calls on to do great things, that God blesses. And then pretty soon we read about a story where there's a lapse in judgment or perhaps a lack of faith. Why do you think this story is here? Yeah, I think it serves a similar purpose as the story of Noah. Is that, don't think that Abraham is this perfect, larger than life superhero that we can't relate to, that, is counted by God as righteous because he was perfect and blameless. All right. And again, Abraham should point us to Christ, to the Messiah. He is an archetype of Christ, but we're seeing right away that he is not the Christ, and that we are still to look forward to a Messiah to see that seed promise be fulfilled. Any other questions or thoughts about this story before we move on? We're trying to cover some ground here, so I don't mean to move too quickly if anybody has a thought or a question. All right. So let's move on to chapter 3. So in chapter 3, both Abraham and Lot have become very wealthy, presumably, at least in part, because of what Abraham receives from Pharaoh in Egypt. But we read that Abraham was very rich in livestock, silver, and gold in verse 2. So they come back to the same region they were before. They're from the Negev and Bethel and Ai and all these places back to some of the altars that he had made. But the problem now is that the land where they were previously is no longer able to support both Abraham and Lot, because they've now got large livestock, and so it's causing conflict between their servants. As you can imagine, trying to keep their livestock separate. And wait, is that ours or is that yours? All that stuff. So it's causing a problem. And so Abraham, in verse 8, seeks to make peace between the two of them, to resolve this issue. He says, "Please let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are relatives." And so he gives Lot a choice. Abraham would have certainly been right to choose what he wanted first, but he gives Lot the option first, and I think that just kind of shows Abraham's generosity, perhaps. And so we read in verse 10 that Lot raised his eyes and saw all the vicinity of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. And this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt going toward Zor. So Lot looks out, and what does he want in terms of where he's going to settle? He wants the best. He wants the good place where it's going to be easy for him to grow what he wants to grow, to have his livestock, to water and feed his flocks. And so we can understand that, right? That would make sense. If you have the option, you're not going to choose the worst. You're going to choose the best. Now, there's an interesting detail mentioned there in verse 10. It says, "This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah." Now, if you're in 2026 reading this for the first time, that detail is kind of odd, I think. But keep in mind that if you're reading this in like the generation after Moses who's writing this, they would have known about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. So as they're reading this and they see, well, wait a minute, Lot is going right where those two wicked cities were destroyed. Why is he going there? Well, this is making clear this is before that happened. And so we're going to read about that later. But it's already giving us an indication of why Lot's choice is going to be a problem. And in verse 11, it says, "So Lot chose from all the vicinity of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward, so they separated from each other. And Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the vicinity of the Jordan, and moved his tents as far as Sodom." Verse 13, "Now the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked sinners against the Lord." So you see how this is already like giving you foreshadowing of how things are not going to go well for Lot. Um, again, I think we see this contrast though of Abram living as an alien, not setting down roots. He's pitching his tent in the land of Canaan, this promised land, and Lot chooses land outside of that. And where does he go? What does he go near? The big wicked cities. Okay, so you see that contrast there again. So Abraham comes, settles again in Canaan, and God again is repeating these promises. You're going to see God again and again and again repeating similar promises to Abraham. And so in response, in verse 18, he settles in Hebron and builds an altar to the Lord. All right, so that brings us to chapter 14. So chapter 14 describes this war between all these different kings, and I don't think in your mind that these are like big, large empires. We're really talking about these small city states. Back in that day and age, you only had so many large empires. A lot of times you had a city, and then there was a king of that city. And so I really think that's what's being talked about here. You have these kings of all these different places in the land of Canaan and the surrounding areas. And so we'll just kind of summarize quickly what's going on here. You have this king, Chedorlaomer. I'm not sure exactly how it's pronounced. I've been saying King Cheddar. Um, this group of kings and cities were paying tribute to King Cheddar for a period of 12 years, but then they decide they don't want to do that anymore. So they rebel, and so King Cheddar gathers his coalition of kings, and so one coalition of kings fights against another coalition of kings, and they go to war. King Cheddar's army, his coalition, is successful. Now, why do we care about that? Why is this seemingly random story about this warfare thrown in the middle of the story of Abraham? Well, in verse 11, the battle goes all the way to Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah fall. In verse 11, it says, Then they took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food supply and departed. They also took Lot, Abram's nephew, and his possessions and departed, for he was living in Sodom. All right, so why does this matter? Because Lot, in part because of his choice to live in that area, is caught up in this conflict, and he is captured, and now he is a captive of King Cheddar. Notice also, though, we don't know exactly how much time passes between chapter 13 and 14. I think the implication in chapter 13 is that Lot moved his tent and lived near Sodom, but notice what it says in verse 12, for he was living in Sodom. And that, you can imagine how naturally, the more we kind of place ourselves near sin, how we start to get sucked in, right? And you can see how that happens in your own life as well. So a survivor from all of this conflict comes and tells Abram in verse 13. Notice verse 13 he's referred to as Abram the Hebrew. As far as I know, that's the first reference to that, to Abram and his descendants as that, as being a Hebrew. And he is told about what happens. And so Abram has troops. It may surprise you. In verse 14, it says, when he heard his relative had been taken captive, he led out his trained men born in his house, numbering 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. So that tells you he at least has how many servants? 318, right? Okay, you're following along. But probably what that really means is he's got 318 that are trained for fighting. And he probably had a whole lot more that were not trained for fighting. So I've seen some people, we don't know exactly, but I've seen some people speculate that he had to have had probably 1,000 or more servants if he's got just 318 that are trained for fighting. So that ought to give you, if you own a company that has 318 employees, again, we think it's probably more than that. That's a pretty large company. Abraham has a lot of wealth, is my point. That just gives you a little sense of the scope of his wealth and how prominent he would have been in this region. So he takes his 318 fighting men. They go, they divide their forces. We're not told much about the battle, but basically he's successful. He's able to recapture those who had been taken captive, including Lot, and brings them back. But what I want to really look at here is in verses 17 and 20. It says, Then after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were there with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High. And he blessed them and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has handed over your enemies to you. And he gave him a tenth of everything. I don't know about you, but this is a passage that just blows my mind. When I read it, I'm like, what? Because it raises so many questions and gives way more questions than answers. So what do we learn about this Melchizedek from the few verses we just read? Who is he? He's a priest. What else? He's the king of Salem, which is Jerusalem. All right. Really, that's about it. Who's he a priest of? He's a priest of God Most High. So there's all kinds of questions that this raises for us. Because he's a king of one of these cities of Canaan, which we would have thought are all Canaan or all pagan. And yet he's not just a believer of God, he's a priest of God. And Abram certainly recognizes his authority because Abram gives a tenth to Melchizedek. So I don't know whether Abram knew who he was before or what. Clearly there's a lot more to all of this than we can know and understand. And so he just kind of comes out of nowhere and disappears. We never read about Melchizedek, at least in his life, again. And really, we don't read anything else about Melchizedek whatsoever in the Bible until about 1,000 years later in Psalm 110, which is a messianic psalm of David. In verse 4, it says, The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. So Melchizedek just kind of appears out of nowhere, disappears, and then we never hear anything else about him for another 1,000 years in the days of David or so. And who is he compared to? Who's going to come after him? Jesus. What? Like, who is this guy? All right. Then we don't read about Melchizedek again for another 1,000 years. Turn over to Hebrews chapter 6. So we have this messianic prophecy that says the Messiah will be a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. And then Hebrews, don't hear about him again until we come to the book of Hebrews. He's mentioned briefly in chapter 5, but then he's talked about in depth in beginning in the last verse of chapter 6 and going into chapter 7. So let me just read here. Verse 20, where Jesus has entered as a forerunner for us, having become a high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the God Most High, who met Abraham as he was returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom Abraham apportioned a tenth of all the spoils, was first of all, by the translation of his name, King of Righteousness, and then also King of Salem, which is King of Peace. Without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, he remains a priest perpetually. Now observe how great this man was, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a tenth of the choicest spoils. And those indeed of the sons of Levi who received the priest's office have a commandment in the law to collect a tenth from the people, that is, from their countrymen, although they are descended from Abraham. But the one whose genealogy is not traced from them collected a tenth from Abraham and blessed the one who had the promises. There's a pretty long section here. We could spend a lot of time studying this. But let me just try to make sense. If you read that and you're confused, I think you've got the right idea. I don't think anybody can be totally certain after reading the little bit we read about Melchizedek, and be totally certain about who he was, what he means, how it is that Christ relates to him. But let me just tell you how I make sense of this and why Jesus is compared to Melchizedek in Hebrews. I think I know Hebrews is making the overall point about the superiority of the Christ and how Jesus is a perfect high priest, but far greater than any Levitical high priest. And the Hebrew writer is making the point here that Jesus is a priest more like Melchizedek than like a Levitical priesthood. Why was Melchizedek greater than the Levitical priesthood? Well, who was the ancestor of the Levitical priests? Abraham. All right. And Abraham paid a tithe to Melchizedek. So in a sense, Melchizedek was greater than Abraham, and Melchizedek is the one blessing Abraham and not the other way around. But why else? Melchizedek, his name means king of righteousness. He's the king of Salem, which means he's the king of peace. And so Melchizedek is, again, kind of one of these archetypes of Christ who points us to Christ. Melchizedek existed before the Levitical priesthood. We're not told about a beginning and end. I don't think that necessarily means he's this eternal being, but he is more like Christ than the Levitical priest. He's not a priest because he was just born into the priesthood. He doesn't just pass his role on to his son. He is kind of outside time from our perspective. He has no beginning, has no end. Instead, he fulfills his role as priest in a way that none of the Levitical priests can. And certainly we would say that about Jesus. Jesus completely fulfills his role as priest. He has no beginning. He was there in the beginning. And so why is Jesus a priest? Well, Hebrews 7 verse 16 says he became a priest according to the power of an indestructible life. Again, if you're still confused about Melchizedek, you're right there with me, because it's still hard to wrap my head around. I would encourage you to read through chapter 7 of Hebrews if you want to kind of explore that more. I don't think we should have a complete understanding of who Melchizedek is, because he's a very mysterious character here in the Bible. But clearly he was important, and right there with Enoch, he's somebody you can ask more about in heaven one day. Let me just talk. We have one more minute. Let me just talk about Genesis 15 briefly, and that will give us a chance to get right into the story of Hagar and the birth of Ishmael next week. So when we come to chapter 15, we see a couple of moments where Abraham, I think, is struggling a little bit with how these promises are going to be fulfilled. So he kind of asks God, well, how are you going to do this, and things like that. And so God is reassuring Abraham. He tells him some things that are to come. He even tells him, if you look in verse 13, he even prophesies about the Exodus account and how his descendants will be enslaved. So I just want to point out chapter 15. We don't have time to cover it in detail, but again, Abraham is not this larger than life person. He's not a man of faith because he never had any doubt. He never questioned what God was doing. He did, just like Job did, if you read the story of Job. But despite that doubt, he acted in faith, he obeyed, and that's what we're going to see by and large in the story of Abraham. So read chapters 16 through 22. We probably won't get all the way through 22, but our goal next week is to cover the birth of Ishmael, cover the birth of Isaac, and so that means we'll probably have to skip some of the stories in there, or at least, kind of mention them in passing. But if you read through chapter 22, you'll be well prepared for next week. Thank you.